Hello everyone, and thank you for joining the first of a series of episodes on recent developments under the SFDR. My name is Áine McCarthy and I am the knowledge lawyer in the Dillon Eustace Asset Management and Investment Funds team. I'm joined today by my colleague Cillian Bredin, a partner in that team, who leads our internal ESG working group. Today we're going to focus on the definition of sustainable investment under the SFDR and take a look at the recently issued European Commission guidance as well as the proposed amendments put forward by the ESAs to amend SFDR Level 2 measures. Cillian, could you provide an overview of the guidance issued by the European Commission?
Yes, of course. Thanks very much, Áine. So the guidance issued by the European Commission was in response to a list of questions asked by the ESAs, or European Supervisory Authorities, in September of last year, mainly on the problematic definition of sustainable investments under the SFDR. So as you know, under the SFDR, in order to meet the sustainable investment definition test, is a three-pronged test. So firstly, it must contribute to an environmental or social objective. Secondly, it can't do any significant harm to any environmental or social objective. And thirdly, if the investment is an investee company, it must follow good governance practices. So the ESAs pose a range of very specific questions on what may or may not be considered a sustainable investment under the SFDR, and they focused in particular on the contribution limb of that sustainable investment test. So that means effectively how an economic activity will be considered to contribute to an environmental or social objective.
And how did the European Commission respond to those questions?
Well, on the revenue threshold test, it confirmed that it's possible to invest in investments that do not specify the use of proceeds. So on that basis, sustainable investments can be comprised of debt or equity of an investee company. It also confirmed that the contribution test could be measured at the level of a company and not only at the level of a specific activity. So that suggests, for example, that if a fund invests, let's say, in company A, and the economic activities of that company contributed to an environmental or social objective, and that only amounted to 30%, let's say, of the revenue of that investee company, then the fund could still count the entire investment as a sustainable investment and not just 30% of that investment, if that makes sense. Now, aside from that, the European Commission didn't actually directly answer any of the specific questions posed by the ESAs on the topic, but they also didn't provide any specific qualitative or quantitative minimum commitments in relation to the definition of sustainable investment, which is quite helpful. So on that basis, it leaves the door open to fund management companies to be able to classify investment in entities which simply carry out their business in a sustainable manner as sustainable investments. So that's notwithstanding that the actual business activities don't contribute to an environmental or social objective. So by way of an example, a fund could invest in a media company, for example, whose business lines don't contribute to any environmental or social objective, and still classify that investment as a sustainable investment on the basis that the business is run in a sustainable manner when compared with its peers or sector.
So really, fund management companies have retained significant flexibility in terms of how to meet that contribution test when they are bucketing investments as sustainable or otherwise. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the only really thing that the European Commission closed the door on was the possibility of deeming the contribution test to be met solely on the basis that the investment company has identified a transition plan which it aims, I suppose, to achieve that the whole investment doesn't significantly harm any environmental or social objectives in the future. So I think on that one, the industry would have been quite surprised if the Commission had taken a different view, certainly based on how the SFDR is currently drafted at the moment. So it also confirms, I suppose, what many of us would have thought, in that each of the limbs of the sustainable investment, so the contribution, do no significant harm, and the good governance would need to be met at the date of acquisition of the particular investment.
So by and large, this sounds like relatively good news for fund management companies.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the flexibility on how the contribution test could be met has been welcomed by most in the asset management industry, we would say, on the basis really that it won't require fund management companies to entirely overhaul their existing sustainable investment framework. Now, there is a trade-off in that the European Commission makes it very clear that full disclosure should be provided to investors in terms of the methodology used to carry out the assessment of sustainable investments. And it has noted that just because they've not provided any specific qualitative or quantitative criteria or minimum requirements that are set out in the SFDR, that industry participants do need to exercise caution when measuring the key parameters of sustainable investment.
And what are you seeing fund management companies do in response to the European Commission guidance?
I think by and large what we're seeing clients do at the moment is carrying out a review of their existing pre-contractual and website disclosures to assess whether they need to enhance them to ensure that they provide adequate information to investors on, I suppose, the underlying assumptions and the assessments that are used by them when assessing the sustainable investment definition. So I suppose in addition to that, and against the backdrop of significant regulatory focus on greenwashing, I think fund management companies are possibly also taking the opportunity to have a look at their disclosures around what amounts to a sustainable investment and looking to make sure that they're adequate, that they're accurate and that they're capable of withstanding any scrutiny, whether that's by investors or from regulators, for example. And they may also be taking the opportunity to make any tweaks to that disclosure and maybe rolling them in to any updates they might be making to their pre-contractual annexes as part of maybe the fast-track process that the central bank is providing for any other taxonomy-related changes.
Great, thanks for that, Cillian. So just before we draw to a close, is there any potential impact for the sustainable investment framework established by fund management companies to date arising from the ESA's proposals to amend the SFDR Level 2 measures?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that'll really depend on how the fund management company currently carries out their do no significant harm assessment for each sustainable investment that they make, and in particular how they take the mandatory PAI indicators into account. At the moment, because the taking into account of PAI indicators isn't defined under the SFDR, there is absolute discretion when conducting that assessment. And the ESAs have noted, I think, that they're seeing a range of practices, including using criteria which is quantitative, qualitative, or a mix of both, or anything at all that could be qualified as taking into account. So they have actually proposed that the industry participants will have to disclose the quantitative thresholds that are used by them when performing the do no significant harm assessments. And I think the idea there is to allow comparability for investors. And they've also confirmed that fund management companies still have full discretion in terms of the methodology that's used to assess do no significant harm compliance. But again, similar to the definition of sustainable investments, rather than imposing any specific criteria as to how those thresholds which need to be exceeded in order to consider an investment as doing significant harm to a particular objective, rather than requiring that, they're focusing on enhanced disclosures to that do no significant harm framework. And really the idea and the hope being that, that'll allow investors to make a more informed decision of their investment.
Great, thanks Cillian, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We hope you found our conversation helpful. Please just visit our website dilloneustice.com in order to access the 2 remaining episodes in our series on recent developments under the SFDR.